Welcome to Unit 7, Section 3. In this section, we're going to be talking about the Cold War and how it begins. And again, just like in Section 2, where we said World War II is almost a continuation of World War I, the Cold War in a lot of ways is going to be a continuation of World War II. However, maybe not as much so. And there definitely will be kind of an end of World War II, but really almost immediately the Cold War starts right almost from that conflict there. Now, the reason we call it a Cold War is because the two major countries who were in opposition with each other, primarily being the Soviet Union and the United States, here we have the U.S. flag and here we have the Soviet Union flag, are going to be the ones going against each other, but they will never actually officially fight each other in open war. Okay, it will be a Cold War. We will fight each other through economic achievements, through technology, through militarism, and also through proxy wars. We will fight each other through other countries. But this war is going to come really right out of World War II. So here's our objectives. Our focus question stays the same. Should the United States intervene in global conflicts or should it stay neutral? And objective one, what created the early tensions between the U.S.S.R. and the U.S.? Because if you remember, in the U.S.S.R. under Joseph Stalin, he was actually an ally of ours in World War II. In fact, we even called him Uncle Joe. So how on earth did we go from that to hating each other and really competing with one of the most financially expensive and really one of the most dramatic conflicts in U.S. in human history. And objective two, what were some policies that the U.S. and the U.S.S.R. implemented to divide communism and capitalism? We're going to talk about this idea of this term called communism, what it is exactly. We're going to talk about what capitalism is, and we're going to talk about the different ways that each leader from both countries divided the other. And then objective three, what are some ways that both the USSR and the US tried to influence its citizens and the rest of the world? Okay, how did the USSR try to get allies? How did they try to get people to like them, to think communism was better, and vice versa? How did the US? Now, what's really important to look at is much of the world today, its economic beliefs, its government policies, the governments that they have, the way that people think, come from this conflict. If we look at Cuba, for instance, Cuba is a communistic regime government. China, a lots of even Russia today, a lot of these countries get their viewpoints and their feelings towards the United States from the Cold War. And it's the same way if we took several countries, Guatemala, or if we were to take, South Korea or other countries like that, much of their identity comes from this conflict as well. So a lot of the world is shaped by this conflict. So let's talk a little bit about the Cold War for a second. The roots of the Cold War, again, started at the end of World War II. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, is going to serve and he's going to finish off World War II, but he's going to die in April of 1945. Okay, he's in his fourth term. He's going to die. Here he is seated with, again, Churchill and Stalin. Okay, and this man was amazing. I mean, whatever your beliefs are, if you think FDR is a good guy or a bad guy, but he was amazing at how he tried to unite Joseph Stalin and Churchill. Unfortunately, because of his death, President Truman is going to take over, and I'm not saying he was bad, but he really didn't know. Unfortunately, FDR really had not prepared his vice president and gave him a lot of information about what was going on between these guys. If he had, there might have been a way that Truman could have caused a lot more easing of tension rather than increasing tension, which is what's going to happen. So we're still in World War II. The European front is over. We're done with Germany. We're done with all that stuff. But we're very much still active in the Eastern front, in the Asian front. Okay? So American and Soviets are going to be different in some major ways. And here's some major differences. I would write this graph down in your notes here. So the U.S. uses a system in economics called capitalism. Now understand this. Capitalism is not a government type. It's not democracy. It's not a republic. It's an economic theory. Okay? And primarily capitalism is the idea that you can own your own products. Okay? And here are three things that capitalists generally believe in. Number one, free elections. Usually in capitalist countries, the people are free and in some kind of a democracy, republic style government. And so the United States has free elections, right? The also big thing with capitalism, one of I think the primarily biggest things is going to be property. In capitalistic countries, you as an individual can own your property, meaning the farm that you might farm at that is owned by somebody. Gore Farms or whatever is owned by me. I own the farm. It's my property. That's not the case in other countries. So in capitalism, you own your own stuff. You own your own product. Who owns the iPhone industry? Not the government. Apple. Apple, the company, and whoever its shareholders are. And also a lot of different types of freedom: freedom of thought, freedom of expression, religious freedom, all of those things. Okay, the USSR is going to be very different. Okay, it's going to be under a dictatorship, which is a type of government. Okay, but a dictatorship is a form of government of a totalitarian. It's a government thing. It's not an economic thing. It's so in the U.S. we have a democratic republic. In the USSR they have a dictatorship. They also, instead of being capitalistic, are communist. This idea of communism, it comes from the word common, right? Commune, belief that everybody is sharing everything, okay? That the working people are no longer working to just give to the rich and the rich just take advantage of them, but that the working people are the ones that are getting the benefit of their labor. But to do that, the government has to have a pretty hefty hand, okay? At least in the communistic countries that we've seen. Meaning, Joseph Stalin is going to own, or not him, but the country, the USSR, is going to own all the farms. They're going to own all the property. So you don't have Gore Farm. You might run the farm, but you don't own it. The government owns it. And theoretically, nobody's richer than other people. Everybody kind of is on an equal playing field. Everyone gets exactly what they need. And that way we don't have social classes, okay? But there's a lot more, at least in the USSR sense, there's a lot more dictatorship. There's a lot more control, totalitarian control, okay? So the end of World War II, these guys are all meeting together. We were allies. We all fought together to end the conflict in World War II against Germany, okay? But there's some different feelings of resentment. Churchill still holds on to the belief that England is the greatest country in the world and that it's going to continue to be an imperialistic power. It owns Hong Kong, it owns India, it owns much of the Southeastern Asian countries, it owns the Middle East. It is the tried and true imperialistic country. FDR, and I might be biased, I think he's the most progressive looking. He's the one that sees the horizon. And he says to Churchill, that system of imperialism is over. It's done. We're not going to continue doing that. And he really tries to push Churchill. Churchill will not be very happy, but tells him, you need to give these countries back control of their own countries. Because again, World War I and II, the whole reason that they were caused is because these countries had nationalistic ties, and the people within them had ethnic nationalism and wanted to be freed from them. So you're gonna have him and you're gonna have Church or FDR trying to convince him of that. Now Joseph Stalin is going to be embittered. He's going to be very angry. He, after all, lost almost 23 million people in the Soviet Union, which the U.S. and the U.S.S.R. and England didn't even come close to that many. Not even close to that many people dying. So he's going to feel a little bit entitled. He's going to say, now that we have this land from Germany and we have all these other countries, we ought to take them over and split them up. And I ought to own a bunch more than you guys because I gave up and sacrificed the most. The problem is FDR again says we need to learn from World War I. We're not going to come and take control of these countries. We're not going to even make them pay us back. We're not going to blame anybody like we did in the Treaty of Versailles. Instead, we're going to forgive. We're going to help rebuild. We're going to build good relationships. We're going to not allow this to happen. Now, I'm probably over making FDR look a little bit too, peaceful, hippie, kind of kumbaya. But he really did have this belief that we really couldn't do that. And Stalin is going to agree, all of them are, in fact, that they're going to eventually give the land back to these people and allow them to have their own countries. But one of the major problems is that's going to backfire. Stalin's not going to hold to that. So they all meet in Yalta, okay, in Europe. This is a location in Yalta, in Ukraine. And they're going to meet in 1945. And what they're going to do is they're going to say, we need to split up these different countries. And England and the U.S. are going to, and even eventually the U.S.S.R. are going to agree that they all need to let these countries have their own free elections, choose their own governments, choose their own way of system. Okay? But the U.S.S.R. is going to have some really tough times with this. They're going to want more control over Eastern Europe. They're going to want to turn these Eastern colonies that Germany used to own into satellite states. A satellite state is a nation that is controlled by another nation. So they want to own Latvia, Lithuania, all Estonia. They want to own Poland, Ukraine. They want to own all these countries as satellite nations because they feel like they deserve them because they lost 23 million people. So this is going to cause a major crash. Now, I think if FDR had lived, I think he might have been able to figure out a way between Churchill and Stalin and figured out a way to make this resolved. But unfortunately, he dies. So Truman comes in, and Truman really is not educated on this. Again, FDR does not teach him really what's going on. And so there's going to be a major clash between Truman and Stalin. Stalin is going to kind of go back on what he had said. Truman is going to blame him and say he's a liar. And so there's going to be a meeting in Potsdam in 1945. And the new president, Truman, is going to go and he's going to say, you gave your word that you were going to give these countries their free elections, and now you're going back on it. You are a communist liar. There's going to be a lot of contention here, okay? And because of that event, that going on, it's going to cause another 46-year struggle that we call the Cold War. Again, we call it cold because the U.S. and the U.S.S.R. never actually faced off directly, but it is a constant time of frustration, anger with one another, okay? And so these two countries are going to be basically competing to become who's the number one world power, okay? So this meeting between the Soviet Union, the U.S., and England is going to happen. Now, Winston Churchill is going to believe that Stalin has ulterior motives. And to some degree, he's right. Stalin did. Now, I don't know if Stalin really was wanting world domination, but he may have. And Churchill certainly believes that. So on March 5th, 1946, Churchill's going to give an argument, or a speech, I should say, and it's gonna be called a speech about the Iron Curtain. And here you have like a little political cartoon, again from Dr. Seuss, depicting what Churchill meant. Now you think about an Iron Curtain, what does that even mean? An Iron Curtain can mean a lot of different things, but in this, Churchill is meaning that in Europe, a not literal but a figurative curtain made of iron, which iron is a symbol of the Communist Party, is spreading throughout Europe. And it's splitting it from, like England, free elections, free people, capitalistic, to the other side, communistic, controlled by the government, no freedom at all side. And you have this big separation between the two. The U.S.S.R. is going to start to invade and install communist governments and turn them into what Stalin had originally wanted, these satellite states. So the only solution is for the U.S. to be the country that stands against them. That's what at least Churchill sees. Churchill and England are really in no position to really be fighting or to be competing because they had taken such a huge brunt of the war in World War II. But the United States is kind of it's the emerging world power. And so now you have this competition between who's the rest of the world going to follow? Are they going to follow the U.S. in capitalism, or are they going to follow the U.S.S.R. and communism? Now, you might wonder, like, why on earth would anybody follow Stalin and communism? And a lot of it is security. If you look at India today, there's a lot of people in India who actually are advocating for communism. And you might say, why on earth would anybody ever advocate for communism? Again, it comes down to this idea that the USSR can say, hey, you might not be rich, you might not have everything, but what we can promise you is that you're going to have the things that you need to have. You're going to have the things that are the basic necessities. And so that's what the USSR is going to promise some countries. Other countries aren't going to have a choice. The USSR is going to come in, take them over, and they won't have a choice if they're going to be a part of it or not. They're going to be forced into it. So Truman's going to face this major crisis, okay? Number one, he's the vice president. He never was necessarily planning on becoming the president. He has no formal education. He never went to college, okay? He's just a hard-working farmer, and he is just an honest dude, an average Joe, right? But he does have this mentality of hey, when I say I'm going to do something, I'm going to do it. And when I do something, it's me that if you're mad about it, if you don't think it worked, it's me that's in charge. I'm the most accountable person. Meaning, he actually has a sign. You can see it right here on his desk that says the buck stops here. Meaning, he's not going to, when you come and say, hey, this didn't work, Truman, you screwed it up. He's not going to try to pass it off to somebody else. He's not going to blame someone else. He's going to take that and he's going to say, yep, it's my fault. It's all on me. Okay. Now, Asia and Europe are just devastated. Okay, so the U.S. is going to be probably one of the most financially stable countries at the time, and they are going to aid any countries who are not going to be communistic. So if you promise you won't be communistic, if you promise to be free and capitalistic, we're going to give you some money to help you in the struggling time. This really helps the United States. Now, by the way, let's make a connection to today. Look at China. You may not realize this, but China is doing the same thing. Look at what they're doing in Africa. They are paying for road systems, infrastructure, government. They're paying for all sorts of things. Why? Because they're trying to build good relationships so that way they can also become a more dominant world power. Okay? So Truman's going to have this doctrine. It's going to be actually called the Truman Doctrine, which is going to be, we are not going to go fight Stalin, but we're going to make sure that his form of government, communism, does not spread any farther. Okay? And so we're going to see him do that through a lot of different countries. For instance, Turkey and Greece. Truman's going to ask Congress for a bunch of money, and he's going to say, this money is for stopping communism from growing. And for instance, he gives $400 million to Greece and to Turkey, okay? Just to give them money to continue to help them be successful, but at the same time not go towards communism because they're poor and struggling. So he's going to continue doing that. Now, Truman's going to argue that appeasement and isolationism, which, if you remember, that was the fourth, what I called cause of World War II. He's going to say those are the things that led to World War I and World War II. And he's going to say we can't turn a blind eye. We can't be nice to Stalin. We can't appease Stalin. We have to do something now to stop him. Okay, so again, the Truman Doctrine is when Truman said he was going to provide any aid to a country that was struggling against communism. Okay. Now, part of this is going to be through more than just government. A lot of this is going to be through different types of magazines and comic books. Like a lot of the comic books that we love today, you should know that they came from this conflict. This idea of the Soviets and the communists are bad and America is good. It's going to come from this time period. So a couple examples of this is like magazine Foreign Affairs. Author X is going to write this article called The Sources of Soviet Conduct. It's going to be basically demeaning how the Soviets conduct themselves. George F. Kennan, who's the author, he's X, created this policy of what we call containment, meaning his belief is that we can keep communism contained to the areas it's in and not let it out. It's kind of like, think of it like the COVID virus. We can't necessarily get rid of it, but what we can do is we can make it so it doesn't grow, it doesn't spread anymore. That's kind of going to be the idea here. Kennan's going to argue that Stalin was, while Stalin is going to be in charge of this and he's going to be this leader, he wouldn't risk his entire empire if the U.S. is going to take a firm position. And so we have this quote here. Look at this quote from Kennan. He says, "We are going to continue for a long time to find the Russians difficult to deal with. It does not mean that they should be considered as embarked upon or a do-or-die program to overthrow our society by a given date." So we're not going to go over and just destroy them or get rid of them by this date. We're not going to do that. In these circumstances, it's clear that the main element of any United States policy towards the Soviet Union must be that of a long-term, patient but firm and vigilant containment of Russian expansive tendencies. It really was true, right? It was a long policy, 46 years. Yeah. And I really kind of think the United States has continued this policy. Look at how we deal with Iran. Look at how we deal with North Korea. We don't go in to fight them directly. We haven't gone in and killed them or taken out their leaders or said, by this date, we're going to, be done with Iran. Instead, we just tell Iran what they're going to do. And then we decide that we're going to, if they go outside of those lines, we're going to, ensure that they stick within that. Okay? So some other plans are going to come about as well. There's going to be the Marshall Plan, which is going to be this idea that we need to help the rest of Europe as much as we can. It's going to come from Secretary of State George C. Marshall, who created the plan. Okay, that's why it's called the Marshall Plan, not the Gore Plan. Okay, and it recognizes that Europe is in economic ruin, and so it decides that it's going to help these countries that are impoverished. Congress approves a total of $13 billion to the nations in Western Europe, and it's even actually going to offer money to Eastern Europe too. But imagine this, if Eastern Europe, like Stalin in Russia or other places in Eastern Europe, if they accepted that money, what would that say about Stalin and communism? It would say that it failed, right? And so Stalin, of course, he says, we're not taking your money. We don't need your money. We're a strong communistic country. We'll be on top sooner than later. So the U.S. is going to provide this aid, but it's going to seek a commitment. It's going to say, hey, we need this help. Now, this should sound familiar. Donald Trump just took away $500 million from the World Health Organization. Why? Because he doesn't feel like they were doing enough in helping us against China or helping us with COVID-19. So he took away $500 million. Again, we give a lot of money, but don't misunderstand, that money is not just given freely. That money is expected with strings attached. Meaning, if we're going to give money to France, if we're going to give money to England, if we're going to give money to other countries, we then believe that they must do certain things to help us. They got to support us. When the Iraqi war started and England helped us, but France didn't, the United States took a lot of money away from France as saying, we are angry that you would not defend us, your friend, in this conflict. And so a lot of this was for these countries to stay loyal to the United States. That way we could defeat them. And you can see, look at the countries. Look at this. $3.2 billion given to England. $2.2 billion given to France, right? So much, $70 million given to Portugal. All these countries got so much money in an effort to protect them and keep them from communism. The Cold War is going to be cold, but it is at times going to heat up, meaning there are going to be times in the Cold War where there's going to be a little bit more fighting and escalation going on. France, U.S., and Britain are going to control Western Germany. And in Western Germany, what's important to remember this is at the end of World War II, Germany is now not owned by the Germans. It's not owned by, there's no German government, there's nothing. So what they end up doing is they start to split Germany in basically half. France, the US, and Britain are going to control one part of West Germany, and the Soviets are going to control Eastern Germany, okay? Berlin, which is going to be very deep in Eastern Germany, is going to be controlled by Berlin itself is actually going to be split itself. It's in Eastern Germany, so it's in Soviet Union territory, but the city itself is also split. Now, you can think this is problematic, right? If the United States owns and is in controlling of Berlin, or at least half of Berlin, but it's surrounded by Soviet Union land in Eastern Germany, that's going to make it really difficult, right? And so the United States is going to try different policies. Now, if they just were to go march into Berlin, that could be an act of war, and it could start an actual fight. So instead, the U.S. starts to get really creative. It says, okay, we're not going to go in and do a direct assault on Berlin, but what we're going to do is we're going to do things that basically demonstrate that we're in control. One of those ways was the Berlin airlift. This was in an effort. Berlin, again, is struggling a lot. And so this is an effort to make Berlin, to help Berlin, to save it with some supplies, with food, with those things like that. So West Berlin is going to be called the bone in the throat to the Soviets, meaning it's problematic for the Soviets because the Soviets know Berlin is not doing well, but they don't know what to do. They can't take help from the U.S., certainly, because if they do, that means the U.S. is more powerful and stronger. But they can't also keep ignoring it because the people are getting more and more frustrated all the time. So Eastern Berlin is going to be impoverished, and Western Berlin is going to start to be free and stable. And this is going to be really interesting because the United States is going to decide that it's going to take its Air Force and it's going to instead of dropping bombs, it's going to drop food and in some cases some candy into these impoverished areas to help these people struggling. Now, this looks very good, right? The United States seems like it's doing very nice things and that it's being very kind. And it is. But on the other hand, it also makes the United States look like it is better than the Soviet Union. It's challenging the Soviet Union. And so it's going to also be a way to fight the Soviets without a direct conflict. Stalin is going to say he's going to block the roads and the railways, so he's not going to allow the U.S. to get to Berlin. So the U.S. decides that it's going to just use these aircrafts to fly over supplies, and it's going to just drop them over Berlin. Okay? Stalin can't go and bomb these planes, because if he does, think of how horrible that looks. He's bombing planes that have free food for the people, right? That will make him even look worse. And so we see that the United States is going to do this in an effort to, one, help people out, but in another effort to also try to say, hey, we're really in charge of what's going on here. So there's going to be some different alliances that are going to form. Berlin's going to have its airlift. It's going to be a huge success for the United States. It's going to show that the United States is firm, but it's not going to escalate the conflict anymore. But the United States is going to do some other pretty bold things. Number one, and this group still exists today, they're going to form a group called NATO. NATO stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It formed in 1949. And basically, it's an all for one and one for all system. So France, England, the United States, Turkey, Italy, all these countries basically are saying, hey, we're all in it together. We're all going to help each other out. We're all going to fight for each other, and we're not going to let other countries take advantage of us. They do this as a basically who's on our team and who's on their team. Okay? The Soviets are going to respond by creating their own pact. It's going to be called the Warsaw Pact. And it's also the exact opposite, all for one and one for all. And it's going to be all the Soviet countries. Now, the difference here is this. In NATO, it's going to be, if you want to join NATO, and France, like France, for instance, wants to join NATO, they can join if they want. Nobody's forcing them, and nobody's saying they have to or don't have to. If they don't join, we might not give them money, but they're not being forced to do it. The Soviet Union is forcing countries like Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia to be part of the Warsaw Pact. And these countries, this is basically splitting up the teams and saying who's on whose side. And so anybody in red is on the side of the Soviets. Anybody in blue is going to be on the side of the United States. To this day, NATO exists. When you'll remember, President Trump bombed Syria and Assad for causing or using chemical weapons on his own people. He did so with NATO. France, England, and the United States did that together. And so this is going to be one of the major groups that's going to be super important at this time period. Okay, so let's review our objectives here really quickly and make sure we've answered those in enough detail. So what created the early tensions between the U.S. and the U.S.S.R. and the U.S.? Really, initially, the biggest thing is going to be the idea of who's going to control Germany and who's going to control Berlin. Okay? That's going to be the main focus of what's going to cause that early contention. The U.S. is going to feel like they had promised these free elections and that Stalin went back on his word right here, okay? So that's going to be really the answer to Objective 1. Objective 2, what were some policies that the U.S. and the U.S.S.R. implemented to divide communism, capitalism? Well, first and foremost, we have the Truman Doctrine, okay? That's going to be a policy from the U.S. We're also going to have containment, okay? And we're going to have the Marshall Plan and the Berlin Airlift. Those are all things that are, from the United States perspective, going to be separating that. On the U.S.S.R. side, the refusal to give free elections to other countries will be one of them. The continuation of taking over other imperialistic countries will be another. His blocking of Berlin, the railways, the roads, is going to be another. And his forming of Warsaw Pact and the United States forming NATO are going to be another. So those will all be different things that they do. And what are some ways that the USSR and the US tried to influence its citizens and the rest of the world, okay? A lot of it's going to be, I think the biggest example of this that we talked about here so far is going to be, number one, the Marshall Plan, okay? Because we're using money to try to influence people to be on our side. And then on the other hand, we're going to have the Berlin Airlift, which I think also tried to make us look like the heroes, right? We look so good because we're doing something good, Okay, it really was ingenious. So these are all the things that basically start the Cold War. It's the beginning of the Cold War. The last section of that we're going to talk about in section 4 is going to be about the Cold War expanding and moving on and moving forward. We'll talk a little bit about some of the conflicts that happened then and go into a little bit more detail about that. Thanks, guys.